In today's volatile political landscape, one could be forgiven for thinking that the true spirit of political pragmatism lies in compromise and cautious decision-making. Unfortunately, under Sir Keir Starmer's leadership, Labour has embraced a notion of pragmatism that has become synonymous with fiscal caution, reinforcing stagnation and, paradoxically, creating the very instability the party aims to avoid. The decisions Labour makes today, from slashing the foreign aid budget to fund defence spending, are rooted not in economic necessity, but in an unyielding desire to conform to outdated and limiting fiscal constraints. These self-imposed shackles don't just hinder progress, they actively undermine Labour's own goals. Let us examine, for instance, Labour's decision to cut overseas aid to fund increased defence spending. While some may claim that this is a necessary step for national security, the logic behind it is fundamentally flawed. For one, this policy fails to acknowledge the deeper causes of global instability. Poverty, climate disasters, and failed states are the breeding grounds for conflict, and without development funding, these crises will only deepen, making the world more unstable, not less. Redirecting money from aid to defense doesn't just diminish Britain's moral standing on the global stage, it erodes the long-term stability that the country should be striving for. This decision, contrary to popular belief, does not come from any real fiscal necessity. The extra £5 billion to £6 billion earmarked for defence is a mere pittance relative to Britain's GDP. In fact, it could easily be absorbed through borrowing in the global financial system, which remains heavily reliant on the sterling, or by implementing modest tax reforms such as a wealth tax. Instead, Starmer has chosen to present this as a zero-sum game, where funding for foreign aid must be sacrificed for the sake of defence. But the real issue here isn't economic practicality, it's about political positioning. Labour is determined to present itself as fiscally responsible, even when it's unnecessary, in an effort to counter the Tories' attacks. This misplaced prioritization of fiscal discipline over effective policy is not only misguided but echoes a worrying alignment with the narrow, self-serving worldviews of figures like Donald Trump. Trump's disdain for foreign aid is no secret, and Labour's policy mirrors the same mentality that treats aid as a dispensable luxury rather than an essential pillar of foreign policy. When Sir Keir Starmer heads to Washington this week, he might find himself in ideological harmony with the very forces that have put America first at the expense of the world's poor. Labour's embrace of this logic risks reducing Britain to an insular, self-interested nation, caught up in a race to the bottom. More troubling still is Labour's obsession with fiscal discipline as a virtue unto itself. The party's leaders don't just adhere to fiscal caution, they've woven it into their identity. It's become a central tenet of their economic philosophy, one that they defend at all costs. But this blind adherence to fiscal orthodoxy is not merely a matter of principle, it's a barrier to any meaningful change. Starmer's approach locks Labour into a political and economic framework that fails to respond to the real and urgent needs of the nation. We must recognise that Britain's true fiscal constraints are not a result of excessive borrowing or reckless spending but rather stem from real resource limitations. The country's dependence on fragile supply chains for vital sectors such as energy, food, and manufacturing has left it vulnerable to external shocks. This is a national security issue, not just a market function. While the government dithers over budget deficits, the country's productive capacity is stagnating. Without bold investment in domestic industries and infrastructure, Britain risks becoming increasingly reliant on other nations for the goods and services it needs to function. This is where Labour's decision-making appears even more absurd. Ed Miliband and Steve Reed may talk about fiscal responsibility, but if every pound spent is considered a pound lost from somewhere else, they've already tied their hands behind their backs. The global landscape is changing, and the UK must adapt. But how can Labour even begin to consider the broader challenges, like decarbonisation or technology innovation, when it's unwilling to break free from the fiscal straitjacket it has constructed? By reinforcing the status quo of fiscal restraint, Labour ensures it remains unable to tackle the urgent issues that matter to the British people. It's time to call out Labour's so-called pragmatism for what it truly is, an ideological commitment to a set of economic policies that are no longer fit for purpose. Pragmatism, when applied in this context, isn't about responding to the world as it is, it's about rigidly adhering to outdated dogma, where the belief in capitalism's rules is treated as unchangeable, and historical errors are used as justification for inaction. This is not pragmatism, it's a cop-out. It's a way for Labour to pretend it's making the difficult choices when, in reality, it is merely accepting the terms laid out by the Tories and the status quo. Labour has a choice. It can continue to cling to its fiscal orthodoxy, reinforcing stagnation and yielding to political pressure, or it can break free and embrace the kind of transformative policies that are desperately needed to navigate the complexities of a post-Brexit, post-pandemic world. But to do so, it must confront the real challenges facing the country, not the imagined constraints of its own making. This is not just a matter of policy, it's a matter of leadership. And it's high time that Labour stop pretending that fiscal caution is anything more than a convenient excuse to avoid doing the hard work of building a fairer, more prosperous future.